This is watchable.
Advice level requested.
On the 14th of August, 2005, at 7:30 a.m., Helios Airways Flight 522, a flight scheduled to travel from Cyprus to Prague via Athens, was stuck on a loop 35,000 feet in the sky, and there had been no communication from the plane for over an hour. In a state of confusion, the Greek army sent 2 F-16 fighter jets to investigate, but as one of the pilots glanced a view inside
What is this?
the
I'm
aircraft,
interesting.
they saw that disaster was about to unfold, because the pilots were nowhere to be seen. They were about to witness one of the worst airplane disasters in European history, and it left everyone on the ground with one question. What happened to Helios Flight
121 people on board.
522?
They saw no pilot in the cockpit, only the co-
The story of Helios Flight 522 began at 9 p.m. on Saturday the 13th of August 2005, when a Boeing 737 aircraft, nicknamed Olympia, departed London Heathrow for Larnaca, Cyprus. The plane was owned by Helios Airways, a low-cost Cypriot airline that chartered flights between Cyprus and the rest of Europe. The flight was, initially, fairly uneventful. But then the crew heard something strange. A loud banging noise was coming from one of the plane's doors. Upon further inspection, it also seemed that the seal around the door was frozen. Following procedure, one of the flight's crew members made a note of the incident in the aircraft cabin defect log, and when the plane landed at Larnaca Airport at 1:25 a.m. local time, those notes were passed to the captain for review, who personally spoke to the ground engineer team to ensure a full inspection was carried out. And with that, the crew left, and a full inspection began. The man in charge of the inspection was 44-year-old Alan Irwin, a well-liked and hands-on engineer from the UK who had been hired by Helios Airways on a 6-month contract. Following standard operating procedure for a Boeing 737, Alan carried out a cabin pressurization leak check to test the integrity of the door. To do this, he and his team needed to manually pressurize the plane while it was still on the ground. As part of that process, Alan switched something known as the pressurization mode selector located on the cockpit panel from auto to manual. It's important to remember that a plane's onboard pressurization system ensures that the plane is adequately oxygenated as it gains altitude. This is something that is always done automatically, but a manual option is available in order to perform on-the-ground tests. However, going through this process, Alan and the rest of his team were unable to recreate the problem, and so, after carrying on with other routine checks, he noted down that there were no known defects,
They forgot to
no
turn it back
leaks,
on.
and no abnormal noises. Alan and the rest of his team felt that the onboard pressurization system was working just fine. This is the moment that starts off a chain of events that will seal the fate of everyone on board, because the pressurization mode selector had not been set back to auto. On Sunday the 14th of August,
A system this big and this important for a cabin, wouldn't it be like part of like a routine check before takeoff or something like that? I feel like oxygen is like in the top 5 things you need, to fucking live, motherfucker.
2005, at 3:15 a.m. local time, the aircraft was released for its 6 a.m. flight to Prague via Athens. Fast forward to 5 a.m, the crew for Flight 522 arrived an hour before departure to complete a standard pre-flight briefing. Due to staff sickness, there had been some difficulty in putting together a full crew. Luckily, 2 attendants, Luisa Volterra and Andreas Prodromou, were able to fill in last minute. Initially, Andreas was reluctant to join the crew, but would eventually agree after discovering that his girlfriend, also a flight attendant, was serving as a member of the cabin crew on that particular flight. The 4 flight attendants would join 59-year-old Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten and 51-year-old First Officer Pampos Haralambos, 2 experienced pilots with a collective 23,000 hours of flying experience between them. Together, this crew of 6 would serve 115 passengers, around a third of whom were children. As the cabin crew were preparing for takeoff, They knew that this would be an easy and short flight with experienced pilots. But what they didn't know is that Hans was fired 3 months earlier by British airline Jet2 for repeated failures to comply with standard procedures.
Chad, that seems pretty standard, right? 6 people? 6 people crew for a plane this size? A 737?
In fact, nobody knows this, not even Helios themselves, because Hans' references were never asked for. On top of this, First Officer Pampos also has a record of rushing through checklists, and to make matters worse, the two pilots don't exactly see eye to eye. In fact, Pampos had complained multiple times about Hans' attitude and was actively seeking new employment. Nonetheless, as passengers began to board the plane, Pampos and Hans worked through their standard pre-flight checklist. It is here that the string of catastrophic errors continued. Pre-flight checklists are lists of tasks that should be performed by pilots and aircrew prior to takeoff. In the cockpit, pilots will be working through multiple lists designed to ensure that all switches and indicators are in the correct positions. But Flight 522 was slightly behind schedule, and so, as both Hans and Pampos rushed through their checklists, they both failed to register that the pressurization mode selector was still on manual. At 6:07 a.m., 7 minutes behind schedule, the aircraft took off from Larnaca Airport. For the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. 4 minutes after takeoff, at 6:11 a.m., ground control cleared Flight 522 for a final cruising altitude of 34...
Bro, this is really fucking scary now that I'm watching this. Jesus Christ. Bro, this is incredibly scary.
1,000 feet, and the plane began its climb through the clear blue Cypriot sky. It should be said at this point that only the last few hours of in-flight cockpit recordings are actually available, and so much of this story has been pieced together using the in-flight data recorder, on-the-ground recordings, and testimony, as well as clues from the crash site. And what this all shows is that due to the pressurization mode selector still being set to manual, the cabin was not automatically pressurizing, meaning the air was getting thinner, and there was increasingly less oxygen.
And by the time that it was time to fix it, basically the dudes were they're like high, right? They have hypoxia, and everybody's brain dead, so nobody can do anything.
Even though multiple indicators on the cockpit dashboard clearly showed that the altitude inside the cabin was abnormally high, for some reason neither Hans nor Pampos, two pilots with tens of thousands of hours of flight experience between them, noticed. At 12,000 feet and climbing, yet another fatal and inexplicable error was made when a loud alarm started sounding in the cockpit. Because the pilots had missed the earlier signs that the cabin was not adequately pressurizing, they misread this loud alarm as an erroneous takeoff configuration warning. In other words, a glitch. This was, in fact, the cabin altitude warning alarm.
It must be a glitch.
While the two sound exactly the same, where the alarm sounds indicates which it is, and when it sounds off in the air, it means one thing and one thing only: that there is an immediate and urgent issue with the cabin pressurization, and that oxygen masks should be worn immediately. Neither Hans nor Pampos did this. Instead, at 6:14 a.m, Hans made a call down to the Helios dispatcher on the ground. At first he mentioned the erroneous takeoff configuration warning, which was sounding in the cockpit. This confused the dispatcher, because a takeoff configuration alarm cannot sound at 12,000 feet in the air, and so he handed the call over to Alan Irwin, the on-duty ground engineer who had performed the plane's inspection earlier on in the day. But things became even stranger.
Wait, chat, so they both failed then, right?
The captain began to radio down about a ventilation cooling system error. He stated that, quote, the ventilation cooling fan lights were off. Then, moments later, he directly contradicted himself. To Alan, who was listening in on the ground, the conversation was as confusing as it was bizarre. But perhaps, Alan thought, Hans is confusing two lights that sit closely together, and it was at this point that he asked the captain about the pressurization mode selector, to which he received no reply.
Oh no, fuck off.
Alan didn't realise it at the time, but Hans was behaving strangely because he and his co-pilot were both suffering from rapid onset hypoxia, a condition whereby the body is deprived of oxygen.
I just said something by accident. Drunk PLS unbound. Sarge.
The effects of hypoxia on the human body are strange. At first, the vision worsened slightly.
Chat.
And then
Chat, look, they made the video. The video is so good. I think it's worth for context. It's good. It's good. It's good. It's good. I think it's like a TikTok or some shit.
Starved my brain of oxygen today, and it might save my life. This room has had most of its oxygen sucked out, leaving it at the equivalent
Look, it's worth it. Watch it. Don't get mad at it.
The goal today was to figure out what my symptoms of hypoxia are, so if I ever feel that way while flying, I can hopefully fix the problem before I pass out and crash.
If I say climb, you're going to raise your hands. If I say level off, you're back to senator. Climb, level off, level off, level off, left turn, level off, right climbing turn. Point at me, touch your nose. 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 Mask on.
Alright, so if you don't get on oxygen, you're going to die, right? You're not going to be able to survive this. Go to your regulator, get all three switches up on your regulator. Alright, go to your regulator, get all three switches on your regulator. Alright, let's go ahead and put him on for him. Let's get him back on.
Oh, there's the blocks here?
What is that? Square? What was that one? That was a square? A square. Are you sure what's this one? Oh, you're starting to have a little shake there, you know, that lack of oxygen. You need to start thinking about getting back on oxygen now, Destin. Alright.
Anyway, I'll finish the video. Where's the mother sucker at?
confusion and disorientation begin to set in, quickly followed by a lack of coordination, and then a mood change, which for some can be extreme irritability, and for some, euphoria. What is particularly terrifying about hypoxia is that one of the symptoms can be a disassociation from the self, meaning sometimes people cannot truly grasp what is happening to them. Because Hans and Pampos did not immediately put on their oxygen masks in response to the alarm, at 15,000 feet and climbing, these symptoms were coming on very quickly. And as they set in, a warning light, known as the master caution light, came on to indicate that masks had now dropped inside the passenger cabin. Those masks were able to distribute approximately 12 minutes of oxygen per person, more than enough for a plane to descend to a safe and breathable altitude. This was yet another warning that something was wrong with the cabin pressurization system. But it was too late. Both pilots were now too impaired to understand what was happening, and they were unable to work through the problem logically. Instead, both pilots got distracted by the equipment cooling light, which came on because the onboard computer systems were not being cooled properly due to the inadequate pressurization. And it was this that both pilots chose to focus on in their increasingly hypoxic state. Hans believed that it could be fixed by a system reset, and down on the ground, Alan, still baffled, continued to ask Hans about the pressurization mode selector. Hans ignored him and demanded to know where the circuit cooling breakers were, to which Alan replied, "Behind your seat." 13 minutes after the flight took off, at 6:20 a.m, the line went silent. And Alan, confused but satisfied that he had answered all of the captain's questions, went home.
Huh?
At this point, passengers inside the cabin would have only had a few minutes of oxygen left. We can never know what happened in that cabin, but we can reasonably assume that there would have been panic and confusion. Following procedure, the cabin crew would have been seated, waiting for the pilots to perform an emergency descent to a safe altitude. Instead, the plane was on autopilot and was continuing its climb to 34,000 feet. All the while, the cabin crew would have been aware that the masks were fast running out of oxygen.
Yeah, I'm confused here.
As the passengers and the crew were struggling in their last moments of consciousness, at 6:29 a.m, the Helios dispatcher who initially took the call from Hans contacted ground control at nearby Nicosia Airport. He stated that he hadn't been able to make further contact with Flight 522 for 9 minutes. The dispatcher at Nicosia Airport also failed to reach the cockpit, and at 6:36 a.m, 16 minutes after last contact...
Wait, so tell me that... Okay, I don't want to stop the video, but listen. Out of 4 crew members, none of them realized that they were still going up when the mass has been down for like 10, 8 minutes, whatever the fuck, and nobody did anything.
Flight 522 began to enter Athens airspace and was handed over to Athenian air control. Over the next 40 minutes, the Air Control Centre team at Athens and several
Hypoxia.
planes in the vicinity
They have the mask,
attempted
no?
and failed to make contact. Over 30 calls were made across multiple frequencies. There was, of course, radio silence. Flight 522 still looked as if it was operating as normal, leading teams on the ground to theorise that there was an issue with the onboard radio system. At 7:20 a.m, Flight 522 began what looked like a standard approach procedure, but air control watched on in utter astoundment as the plane began to slowly turn back around in the same direction that it came, entering what is known as an automated holding pattern as part of its missed approach procedure over the Greek island of Kea. And it was here that Flight 522 stayed, flying around on a repeated loop. At this point, teams on the ground knew that something was desperately wrong. By 8:23 a.m, the emergency level was elevated to alert. The Hellenic Air Force had been contacted and 2 F-16 fighter aircraft were dispatched. Just 9 minutes later, at 8:32 a.m, the 2 F-16 pilots described the disaster that was about to unfold
What
before
can they do?
everyone's eyes. Teams on the ground listened in horror as they were told that first...
Question. Maybe you don't know about this, but isn't. If let's say they knew what was going on and it was GG, right? And they were flying above like a very populated area, would they shoot it down at the correct like timing so that people on the ground aren't hit by it?
Officer Pampos Haralambos was slumped over the control panel, and Captain Hans-Jürgen Merton was nowhere to be seen. Later, they would find out that he had passed out, searching for the switch behind his seat. No one was flying that plane. The 2 F-16 pilots went on to describe how all passengers were sat completely motionless, with their oxygen masks dangling uselessly above them.
I saw 2 passengers on the left side of the aircraft. They were sat motionless in their seats and were wearing oxygen masks on their faces. That's when I saw additional oxygen masks dangling from the passengers' overhead units. Even though the passenger cabin was dark, I could see the shadow of the oxygen hoses and masks against the daylight shining through the windows on the other side of the passenger cabin.
The emergency level was now set to the highest possible as rescue teams on the ground attempted to make sense of this horrifying new information. And then, at 8:49 a.m, during the plane's 10th holding pattern, the F-16 pilot observed someone slowly making their way to the cockpit. The person put on a pair of headphones and placed their hand on the controls in front of them. But just 1 minute later, the left engine stopped working due to fuel deprivation, and the plane, all of a sudden, began to rapidly descend. The following conversation is recorded between the 2 F-16 pilots and the rescue teams on the ground. It's at this point that they realise that the person in the cockpit is Andreas Prodromou, one of the flight attendants who agreed to fill in for a sick colleague at the last moment. Andreas, investigators would later find out, was a qualified pilot, and it appeared that he was controlling the plane, but he had no training on a Boeing 737, and the plane was now rapidly losing altitude at a rate of around 1,500 feet per minute.
I mean, what is he gonna do?
The F-16 pilots desperately tried to make visual contact, but Andreas was not responding.
Why was he buzzing as well?
Instead, the words, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Helios Airways Flight 522 was weakly spoken into the cockpit radio, which was set to the wrong frequency. These recordings would later be recovered from the crash site. But as the plane was going down, Andreas was speaking into the void.
Think rate. Think rate. Terrain. Think rate.
So the dude when they were passing out, they probably missing the settings and they changed frequency.
Think rate. Terrain.
Don't say it, chat. Oh my god.
At 8:59 a.m, the right engine on the plane gave out. At this point, Andreas looked directly at the F-16 pilot, slowly lifted his hand, and weakly pointed downwards.
Τη στιγμή δείχνει ο άνθρωπος που κάθεται στο θάλαμο διακυβέρνησης ότι με βλέπει. Ελήφθη. Κάνω τα σήματα αναχέτησης, δεν ανταποκρίνεται, με οπτικό σήμα διαχειρός έδειξε ότι με βλέπει. Συνεχίζει τα περάσει 7.000 το αεροσκάφος. Ποστών αρνητικών στα 5.000 πόδια με πορεία 2.18.
The plane's descent was happening so quickly that the teams on the ground were struggling to keep up.
Το αεροσκάφος είναι στα 2.500 πόδια, πετάει πολύ χαμηλά πάνω από ξηρά. Πάμε 132, πόσο είναι? Altitude. Altitude. Πάμπο, αυτή τη στιγμή το αεροσκάφος δείχνει ότι πάει για το έδαφος. Altitude. Τύχη Μάμπο, το αεροσκάφος πάει προς το έδαφος. Ελήφθη. Πρόκειται για τα κατομάμο. Αθήνα, το αεροσκάφος αυτή τη στιγμή πάει για το έδαφος. Altitude. 100, 1, 3, μέσα, 23 μίλια. Με 23. Altitude. Mayday, Μάμπο, έχουμε πρόσκρουση πολιτικού αεροσκάφους. Έχουμε πρόσκρουση πολιτικού αεροσκάφους. Mayday.
Jesus.
Ελήφθη. Σας αναφέρω συντεταγμένες, Μάμπο. Αναφέρω συντεταγμένες. Έχει προσκρούσει σε κορφή βονού. Mayday. Ελήφθη, αναμένετε συντεταγμένες.
At 9 hours, 3 minutes and 32 seconds, Flight 522 collided with the rolling hilly terrain just outside of Grammatico village at 400 miles per hour, causing a fireball that instantly razed several acres of land to the ground.
Yeah, that was actually really sad.
All
Jesus.
121 people on board lost their lives instantly. Several were members of the same family. Some were couples who went on holiday, leaving their children with their parents. Reports would later show that most passengers were alive, but unconscious. After the wild speculation amongst the media subsided, a 186-page air accident investigation report was written. This report cited multiple failures to recognise the cabin pressurisation issues as they arose on the day, but they also revealed an ineffective and dangerous organisational culture that bent the rules beyond recognition.
Chat, even with no training on that specific plane, there's nothing you can do to maneuver it or whatever, or like a...
In the absence of all but the last hour of the cockpit voice recorder, one question is often asked about Helios Flight 522. Why did the cabin crew not immediately enter the cockpit? And if they did, why did they not make contact with teams on the ground over the radio? This is especially puzzling considering that they had access to several hours of oxygen, as well as, clearly, the cockpit access code. Even the report itself states that it is rather puzzling. But perhaps the on-plane oxygen system can give us a clue. Because of the way the emergency oxygen system works on a plane, it's likely that the adult passengers would have run out of oxygen first. The crew had access to 4 emergency oxygen cylinders, and we know that 3 of them were used. But how and in what manner is unclear.
Wait.
Is it possible that some of the cabin crew may have attempted to share their masks with, say, one or several of the flight's younger passengers? If this did happen, this would have created an extremely dangerous situation, because at 34,000 feet, the effects of hypoxia set in at around 30 seconds, making the window for what is referred to as useful consciousness very short indeed.
Bro, that's fucking
Perhaps,
cooked.
in order to help
You can't
other
make it
passengers, the crew inadvertently incapacitated themselves. Perhaps this was done in the time that their own masks ran out on their way to the emergency oxygen cylinders. Or perhaps Andreas incapacitated himself, helping his partner. These are of course just theories, because ultimately, we will never know.
Wait. So I'm guessing if it's at the back, whatever, they have to make it to the front or like into the cabin and get the oxygen there. They can't make it. It's not possible in that time frame.
Helios
Right.
Airways continued operations until November 2006, but sustained massive losses and eventually went out of business. In 2007, several families of those who died in the crash sued Boeing for €76 million. The lawyer leading the case highlighted...
Wait, what?
Sued Boeing for €76 million.
Okay.
The lawyer leading the case highlighted that having the same alarm in place for 2 different types of dysfunction, one relatively minor and the other with potentially devastating consequences, was negligent. All parties ended up settling out of court. And then, in 2008,
2 sound bites,
4
nice one, dude.
Helios officials, including Alan Irwin, were charged with manslaughter and after a complicated legal battle with the Greek courts, were all eventually found guilty in April 2012. By 2013, however, Alan Irwin had successfully appealed. Other Helios officials were sentenced to 10 years, but were all ultimately able to pay their way out for €79,000.
What?
This has angered some, who feel that to this day, justice has not been served. Today, a memorial dedicated to the victims has been built on the crash site. It stands as a reminder of the lives lost in this
79,000.
unbelievable tragedy.
That's nothing. Two warning lights, huh? I mean, bruh.
Air crash breakdown vids are pop content. Do more.
Yeah, that was pretty mind-boggling, to be honest. Jesus. That absolutely cooked up for sure. Okay. What else? Alright, boys. We could play some games if anyone else wants to play. Either what? Let's get it.
Yo, this is X on the beat, yo. Okay.
Wait, my voice as well.
That ass. Anyone knows that boy? I don't know, he's just so soy. Anyone knows that boy? I don't know, he's just so soy.